doing so many shows lately for the different miniseries we have on this program that we haven't heard that particular introduction in a while. So it's nice to hear it again on this Friday night, the 1st of December, 2023. And on that note, we welcome you back to the Mike the New Haven podcast, episode 287, which is going to be an interesting one I've been certainly looking forward to for a while. It's good to see everybody, of course, in the live chat already. John Albanese and John Costello, both tuning in from Pennsylvania. And shout out to everybody else tuning in via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. If you haven't checked out the previous episode, that was interesting. It was a transit rescue reunion show. So as part of my miniseries, The E-Cops, inside the NYPD's Emergency Service Unit, I gathered previous guests who, in addition to serving in ESU, were also in the old New York City Transit Police Emergency Rescue Unit prior to its merge with the NYPD. That featured Ken Schnetzler, John Bushing, and Anita Rosato. So check out that one if you haven't already. It's in 2 parts here on YouTube, 1 part on audio. But it made for an interesting show, and I was glad to do it. Before we get into tonight's guest, of course, a couple of sponsors will run really, but the first one is, if you don't know I have a consulting company, well, here you go. Need advice on how to start your podcast? Frustrated with the editing process? Can't find a voiceover guy? Hi, I'm Mike Colón, and I'm here to help. I'm the owner and founder of MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company for all things media, where I can offer you consulting advice on how to get started, and once you get started, editing, as well as voiceover work, all for a very reasonable price. If you want to reach me, you can contact me at 917-781-6189 or the email that you see listed here. I'm always available, and I'm always willing to help. Again, 917-781-6189. Why go to some giant consulting firm that's going to charge you an arm and a leg when you can just come to me? If you want to be stress-free, the way to go is to call MC. MC Media Editing Services, your premier consulting company. Premier indeed. And speaking of premier, if you need a PI, go to my man Bill Ryan. The Mike the New Haven podcast is proudly sponsored and supported by the Ryan Investigative Group. If you need an elite PI, look no further than the elite Ryan Investigative Group, which is run by retired NYPD detective Bill Ryan, a 20-year veteran of the department who served the majority of his career in the Detective Bureau, most notably in the Arson and Explosion Squad. So if you need a PI to handle anything from fraud, legal services, and anything else that you might require, contact Bill at 347-417-1610. Again, 347-417-1610. Reach him at his website or the email that you see here. Again, if you need a PI, look no further than Bill Ryan and the Ryan Investigative Group, a proud supporter and sponsor of the Mike the New Haven podcast. Well, he's a hard-working guy. I can attest to that. All right, my next guest has presided as a judge in Suffolk County since January of 2009. A longtime lawyer, he gained valuable experience as a law clerk for Judge Louis Mandarino. After that, he prosecuted crimes as an assistant district attorney with Suffolk County before practicing law on his own for 30 years prior to his appointment to the bench. He's a 1977 graduate of Duquesne University School of Law with a Juris degree, and most recently presided over the opioid trial, and that is Judge Jerry Garguilo, who, of course, is the father of my mentor and previous guest on this show, Joel Garguilo. Mr. Garguilo, welcome. How are you?
Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you for making the time. I've been looking forward to this, like I mentioned, for quite a while. So you grew up in the bakery business. And what's interesting about you is you mentioned this in the previous interview you did some time ago. There'd be some fellas who'd walk into the bakery and you said they always seemed to know what was going on. And you always seemed to listen in on their conversations. And those individuals were lawyers. And that's where your love of law began, correct?
Well, kind of. I worked the early morning hours with my dad. So the early morning before the store people came in, the store help, I would see the early morning customers, 5 a.m., 5:30 a.m., 6 a.m. My dad always felt that if we were renting the place 24/7, we should be open as close to 24/7. I guess he was a forerunner of 7-Eleven, so to speak. I would see the people that appeared to be important coming in. I would overhear their chit chat, and they were attorneys. A lot of them were attorneys doing their Saturday morning golfing or Sunday morning golfing, and I would they seemed to know what was going on, and it piqued my curiosity. What also piqued my curiosity was that my father had a first cousin, Joe Bonacore, who was a lawyer, who I got to know as my career through college, actually. And I would write Joe under my undergraduate years. Don't forget, I went to St. Francis College. St. Francis College is a very important place, stop in my life, in a little town called Loretto, Pennsylvania. And I would write to Joe, and I would ask about the law. I mean, I actually started college thinking I was going to be a history teacher, because we generally pick out careers early on based upon the people in our lives that made an impact. And I had a teacher who made an impact. That didn't last long. After I took one course in the science of education, I said, this isn't for me. And then I went into political science and history and law school thereafter.
And that
And
began the
by the way,
journey.
I suspect that I am the only, maybe the only judge in America that can still make a Kaiser roll of four people by hand.
There you go.
I
That's
could
a
feel
unique distinction.
jelly donuts all night still. So
There you go. That's its unique distinction to have, and I would agree with you in that sense. And you know what? Talking about your father and his business, of course, really it was a family business for the longest time. It's interesting to behold such a work ethic like that early on, because you talk about making an impact. It still guides someone, no matter what profession they choose. They take that work ethic and they apply it to themselves. How would you say all these years later, his and your mother's influence, as far as having a good work ethic is concerned, is still rubbing off on you?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we were always on time. Punctuality was the most important thing. If I showed up less than 15 minutes early, my father would say, "You're late."
Mm. Wow.
First 15 minutes after you get your cup of coffee, you get a buttered roll, and then you get to work. And I think the service business, uh, serving the public in terms of bakery goods, was important to me because I realized serving the public is basically what anybody in a public service should do, and I did it. I do it.
Mhm.
It carried on. Uh, my dad was a spectacular man. Uh, uh, he had a lot of wisdom, and he would share it with us. So, I was the oldest of five. So, as the oldest of five, uh, my grandmother, an Italian, used to say, "Va fadiga, go to work, go help your father." And I was the oldest of five. So, as the oldest of five, it would be my primary duty to go in with my father, oftentimes nights, to produce. My other siblings, Anthony and Neil, would help out more, not so much in production. And my brother Michael now is still a baker. Michael just was the proprietor of the Garguilo Bakery here in St. James. He recently sold the business and the building, but he still manages the place, and it still bears my family name, Garguilo Bakery. And there's a nice bench outside in memory of my mom and dad who passed several years ago.
That's nice. Yeah, I remember Joelle telling me that when she was on last year. She was a little sad that, that it was so, but she did mention that the family, of course, through your brother Michael, still manages it, which is good to see. If I'm out in Long Island, I definitely have to stop by there because I haven't had an opportunity to yet, but that is
Mhm.
on my list, I can assure you. So you go to Duquesne University School of Law, and this is interesting, of course. It's a 4-year stop for you. You ended up graduating in 1977, and studying law, it's one thing to have an interest, but it's another thing to study it because there's so much to go over. There's so many nooks and crannies and facets that one has to familiarize himself with, especially when it comes to case law. So tell me about, this is a two-part question. One, familiarizing yourself, cases that interested you, I guess it's a three-part question, and professors that made an impact on you during that time.
Uh, I was fascinated by the area of evidence because evidence is a roadmap to where a case gets from a beginning to an end. All right. I was fascinated with the constitution law and contracts. I liked it. I liked most everything. Undergraduate was fun. Was 4 years of fun. I mourned the day I graduated and realized I had to grow. It was time to grow up and get going. Law school was work, uh, a lot of work, but you pay attention in law school. All that information that you gather, all from all those courses, uh, comes into play in the practice of law because you recall things. You recall things like upper riparian rights, which is rights of people that live along the water, where the public can go and where they can't go. Little things like that. As professors, yeah, Ray Sakula, uh, my evidence professor, Nick Fisfis, my uniform commercial code professor, and John Shulo. Most importantly, John Shulo became the dean. He was the associate dean, and John Shulo was the professor who recommended me to Justice Mandarino, who was sitting on the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Now, as one of his law secretaries, as one of his law clerks. What's interesting about that is in Pennsylvania, for instance, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the state. Then there's in between this thing called the Commonwealth Courts, which are intermediate appellate courts, and there's the Court of Common Pleas, which is more akin to our Supreme Court here in New York. In New York, the Supreme Court is a trial court. There's the appellate division and the appellate term uh, in between, and then our highest court is called the Court of Appeals. So Justice Mandarino sat on a court that was equivalent to our Court of Appeals. Very smart guy, very smart guy. I enjoyed. He was hot. He was tough because he was so brilliant. I remember, yeah, we had a nice going away party when I left because I had a choice. I took 2 bar exams. I took New York and Pennsylvania at a time when the states had different bar exams, and I was successful in both bar exams, and I knew I wanted to come back to New York, closer to the family. And my wife, although my wife is a Pennsylvanian, from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, we came back to New York. I took an interview with the Suffolk DA's office and wound up there for almost 2 years.
We're talking with Judge Jerry Garguilo here in the Mike Haven podcast, episode 287. Let me give a shout out to a couple more people in the live chat. Darren Phillips, of course, firefighter up in Canada, and Steve Iorato, also a firefighter. Appreciate you guys tuning in tonight. Like I said, everybody else that's watching via YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter. If you have a question for the judge, submit it in the live chat, and I'll get to it at the appropriate time. And if you want to contribute in the super chat, of course, you're more than welcome to do that. So, of course, now as a prosecutor, and my first introduction to prosecutors was watching Law and Order growing up, seeing Jack McCoy, but that's TV, and this is the real thing. And there's a lot of different cases to go over. You have the big ones. Everybody thinks of the major crimes, robberies, homicides. You also have the petty crimes, too. When you first got there, what was the first case you handled?
I think the first crime I actually did in front of a jury was a petty larceny. A petty larceny case with a jury. You do a ton of traffic trials early on, which is pretty good experience because you have very little prep time. In those days, you get 5, 10, maybe 15 police officers show up for their hearings. They'd be standing out in the hallway, and just before the hearing, you would take a look at the document, what they call the accusatory instrument, the ticket, talk to the cop, the police officer about it, go through a run through their testimony, put them on the stand, and they would testify. Oftentimes there was a defense attorney. They would cross-examine. You would have a redirect, and you would get you'd get a verdict, either from a judge without a jury, because mostly all traffic cases are without a jury, with the exception of things like misdemeanor cases. You would get a verdict, and it taught you how to think on your feet. And it also made you realize whether or not litigation was going to be your thing going forward in the future. It's not for everybody. It's something that you either want or you don't want. And I remember when I was early in law school, and I would come home and see my friends. They talked about 2 areas of law. What are you going to do, criminal or corporate, right? And as we sit here today, I would suspect there's probably somewhere between 50 and 75 specialties out there. Everything from environmental law, election law, negligence law, malpractice law, estates and trusts. So that was the peculiar thing. And you have to find out where your niche is, and that's where you wind up. I mean, I'm 73 years old now. And it seems like 47 years have gone, almost 47 years have gone by rather quickly, ups and downs. I'll tell you something about lawyers, though. Litigation lawyers tend not to dwell on the cases that went well. The cases that you dwell on in your mind during your career are the cases that didn't go well for one reason or another. And you replay that track in your mind over and over and over again, and it always comes back to you. And my friends that are still in the business all agree with me. Unfortunately, so many of them are now retired, but I don't see that in the really near future. But certainly something to look forward to.
No, for sure. And the thing about, and this, you touched on it when you were talking about, of course, prosecuting traffic tickets. you have a lot of collaboration with the Suffolk County Police, and that's important. You want to make sure, as a district attorney or assistant district attorney, that that relationship is a good one, especially when you get to the more major cases and it is a robbery and it is a homicide or it's a long-term drug investigation, for example. What those detectives, what those officers who work that case are saying, what they're doing, what evidence they have or don't have, is essential to building your case. So tell me about your personal relationship across those 2 years with Suffolk County PD.
It was good. I mean, the key is candor, candor back and forth. What happened? Is it? Do you see an Achilles heel in the case someplace or not? All right. Uh, I mean, for instance, in cases involving narcotics, there was always a question as to the elements of a search and seizure, for instance. How did it come about? Was it in plain view? Was it not in plain view? And candid throughout my entire career, I told clients, I told witnesses, all I want is the truth. The truth always helps. The truth. There's an Italian saying. My grandmother used to say it. It said, actually, my father would say it. He said, a lie has 10 legs and can't stand up. The truth has two and always stands up. And I've always kept that adage in my head. So my relationship was good. And by the way, even when you become a defense attorney, and I did a great deal of defense work, your relationship with the police is still good because they have their job, you have your job, and it's I'm sure your guests in the past and the future will tell you the same thing. Very rarely is animosity. Everybody understands they have a job to do. You do the job the best you can. All right. And again, the benchmark, the foundation of everything is truthfulness.
Right. No, of course. And you're right. Many prior police officers that I've had on this show and detectives have told me that very thing, that it's not personal, never to take it personal. It's part of the case. You had an involvement in it in a professional sense, not a personal one in most instances. And therefore, they're just doing their job. It's
Right.
exactly what a defense attorney is supposed to do. If he or she is not asking those questions and not pushing to see what they can figure out or see if they can, portray a certain angle in the case that may be the truth after all, then they're not a good defense attorney. So you understand it completely. And, I've heard many experiences of how they don't understand that when they're young officers coming on the job, but the older they get, the better they understand it. In the end, they end up being friends with a lot of these defense attorneys. It's a good relationship overall.
But by the way, an aside, you're dressed more like a judge than me. I like your combination.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Try to dress dapper for the show.
That's not
With
dressing
that,
down. I would wear that to
appreciate.
a wedding.
All
I
right.
would
Well,
wear
there
that to a wedding. That's not dressing down.
you go. I appreciate the compliment there. So before I move on from those years, looking back, of course, you mentioned the traffic tickets, like I said. From those 2 years, is there a major case that stands out?
Those first 2 years?
Mhm.
Yeah. There's one or two. Um, and from one case that I did not prevail as a prosecutor on, the lesson I learned was the importance of a significant the elements of jury selection because I had a very unsympathetic victim, but a victim nonetheless. And I was young. I was still in my 20s, and as I look, and I'm going back 40 plus years now, maybe 45 years, it still sticks in my mind that I should have I should have probed a lot more into people's impressions uh, as concerns a person like that lady way back when, because I was floored when the jury acquitted. I couldn't believe it, and when I asked, because you can speak to a jury after a verdict. When I spoke to some of the jurors, particularly one of the jurors, after the verdict, I got an answer that uh, probably stuck with me for the rest of my career on jury selection because it's an important part. It's as important part of a trial as any. How how important it is to probe and to make people understand, right, that when you are seated as a juror and keep there's a fact that it's out there. The second most honorable form of second highest honorable form of public service is jury duty. First is military and the service, and it's important to get people to come forward, voir dire, speak the truth, right? To come forward and say, you know what, maybe I can't be fair and impartial in this case because I can't put aside my pre-existing opinions about this. I learned that, and I'm glad I did because I never forgot it.
Yeah, it's an important thing to carry with you. There was a term that was going around back then in the 80s and 90s, particularly when New York City was having a high crime wave, where, for example, victims, but even if they're not sympathetic victims nevertheless, gangsters killing each other in the mafia or street gangs. Well, they used to call it a public service homicide. Well, what do we care? It was a gangster. Well, it wasn't doing that much good anyway. But as I've talked about before, previous guest, they had somebody who loved them, so even if they may not be sympathetic to you, generally speaking, they are still a victim nevertheless. So I like that you mentioned that. It's very true.
There was a time that they were an 8-pound baby coming into this world.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I always keep that in mind when I see someone homeless on the street. There was a time that somebody held that baby. Yeah, that aside, let's move on.
Yeah, of course. And that brings us to 1979, where you go into private practice for yourself, which ended up kicking off a 30-year chapter in and of itself. And I'll ask you, was it hard to leave the district attorney's office, or was it an easy decision?
Every I had an intern this summer from Columbia Law School. Brilliant kid. I mean, brilliant, articulate. All right, and I knew he was just finished. He just finished his first year of law school, going into his second year, and he gets a grant from the state, which is probably comes out to about $20 an hour. All right, and his name was Nick, and he had a hell of a background. I mean, his mom emigrated from Central America without a dad with 3 kids. Mom went on to get a master's degree. He's in Columbia Law. I think he had a sister at MIT. And I said, Nick, next year you are going to get offered as a summer intern at one of the major firms, money that's going to knock you on your behind. I said, but take a walk with me. Okay? And I walked him into the district court portion of the building. That's where a lot of action takes place. That's where most misdemeanors are heard. And I walked him there knowing that we were going to run into a lot of former prosecutors, because a lot of that's what former prosecutors do. They eventually leave, in many instances, they leave the district attorney's office and they become defense attorneys. And I must have ran into at least a half a dozen of them. I said, meet Nick, meet Mr. So-and-so, or John so-and-so, former prosecutor. John, what's the greatest job you ever had? Assistant district attorney. A prosecutor, the assistant DA's office. I said, Nick, so understand that when you get these monster offers, and I'm talking monster offers, I mean, for summer, all right. Think about becoming a prosecutor. Just think about it. Right? So he keeps in contact with me, and sure as God made apples, he's getting monster offers. Come on, next summer after his second year, we'll see what he does. But he's let's see, whatever he does, he'll be successful. But he's got a heck of a story, a heck of a backstory, and we'll hear from him.
Oh yeah, good for him, and shout out to him if he's watching or will watch this at some point. I wanted to move into, because there's several different facets to litigation, and we could spend some time on it. And I wrote them down here because, again, looking into not only your story, but overall, you realize just how many components there are to the law. Like you mentioned earlier, used to be 2 back then, or at least that was the perception. Now there's 50 to 75, if not more. But we'll start with criminal litigation, since that's the one people pay the most attention to, because that's the one that makes the most headlines. As a private attorney, what does that comprise of? Because even within that category alone, as we talked about earlier with your relation to the experiences in the DA's office, not all crimes are the same. There's different forms of crimes.
Okay. Run that by me one more time. What does what comprise of?
Criminal litigation, what does that comprise of?
Well, okay. There's an intake. There's the very first time a human being comes to see you, all right? If it's a young person, they come with mom and dad, and there's the intake. And as I matured, there came a time when there was a shift. I was older than the people I was representing, uh, and as an intake, you understand what the charges are because the people come with the papers, and you have a person sitting across the table from you, and you're going to ask that person, of course, there's always a lawyer-client privilege. You're going to ask them what happened, and sometimes they were they asked, "Why aren't you writing this down?" I said, "Because I'm a stranger to you, all right? And there's going to come a time," I said, "when you and I will have a conversation about what really went down, how it happened." I said, "And that has to occur before we get into a courtroom someday with a jury, but you don't forget the vast majority of cases are disposed of by a plea bargain, a plea arrangement."
Mhm.
I said, "But in the event your case doesn't get there, and for the first time I find out what really happened, I can assure you, at the end of the day, uh, I'm leaving at the public entrance, and you may not be." So, so there'll come a time when you trust me enough to tell me that. All right. I remember one night, um, it was late. I was in my office, and I hear some commotion up in the waiting room. I go out, and there's a bunch of bikers uh, in the waiting room. So I walk in, and I walk in there, I look at them, I said, "Look, I don't. If you're here to collect money, I don't know anybody any money. They look like collectors." They said, "No. Have you heard about that murder in this place?" I said, "Yeah, I read it in the papers a few days ago." The guy says, "Here's the shooter." All right. It was dark. It was probably 7 o'clock at night. I bring him into my office, and I said, "What happened?" And he tells me. So I believe him. I believe him. Tell me again. I believe him. Then I ask questions, and I believe him. So I call homicide and said, "You're looking for the shooter at so and so. I got him in my office. I'm ready to surrender him." And this is a rare, 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 rare occurrence. All right. Uh, he'll make a statement, and I'm going to put him in a grand jury. Very few lawyers ever put their clients in a grand jury. All right. Ever. I think in my career, I've done it once, I'm sure of, two maybe, but I put him in the grand jury on a homicide. He shot and killed somebody. All right. The 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 defense was going to be justification. All right. I put him in the grand jury eventually, and know what the grand jury did? They no true billed the case. No true bill means we're not charging him with murder, with a homicide. Uh, that goes with candor. Um, Next step is establishing a relationship, communication with the prosecutor on the case, what your strengths are, what your assets are on the case, what your liabilities are on the case, back and forth. Once again, candor is always candor and honesty and truthfulness. Because once you get a reputation in this business for not being honest, all right, it'll stick with you, and that's a rough reputation to kick. Uh, you go back and forth, and there's what they call the discovery process. Now, let me tell you what discovery is. In any case, whether it's a criminal case, a civil case, any case, if everybody does their job the right way, I know everything about your case, you know everything about my case. All right. I know your best case scenario, I know your worst case scenario. You know my best case scenario and my worst case scenario. And you go through the discovery. And then, of course, there comes a time where you conference the case with the court. And the court brings in criminal cases, they bring you into chambers and say, "What's this case all about?" Judges always know what the case is about when you go in there anyway. And they ask, where are negotiations up to right now? And you tell them where negotiations are. Sometimes the judge puts in their recommendation, but it's not binding, right? Uh, the recommendation. And you go back and you say, "This is the best I can do. If you know, if you take this deal, this is, in all probability, this is what the punishment is going to be. If you don't, the punishment could be worse." That's a fact of life. All right. That's the process of criminal. The criminal trials, all right, was probably the area of law that I enjoyed the most as a defense attorney, because you learn things. You learn certain techniques. Judge comes out and will instruct the jury before introduces the prosecutor, introduces the defense attorney. All right, gives them the name of the case, essentially tells them what the allegations are, what the charges are. And then the judge instructs the jury. All right, and there's that process called voir dire. That's the conversation back and forth between the lawyer and the jurors, one at a time. All right. What I learned, and it was something I did. I said, the honorable Judge so and so just told you that this person sitting next to me is presumed innocent. All right, presumption of innocence. Okay, who here on this whole panel, all you people that are being questioned, who here agrees that every person in this country is presumed innocent until proven guilty? Raise your hand. And I raise my hand. They all raise their hand. I said, okay, you're home tonight. You're sitting at home with your significant other, your family, and there's a commotion outside. And you look outside, and there's a couple of sector cars, police cars, across the street, and Junior is being taken out by the police. Do you go back to the dinner table and say to your company, excuse me, don't assume anything, he's presumed innocent, or do you say, what the heck did he do wrong? I said that's something I'm going to ask all of you to overcome. It was one of the things that came to me along the way, and it worked. All right, it worked. Everybody understood that we all come to court. People come to court with ideas, with notions and opinions, neither right nor wrong. Everybody's entitled to their opinion, uh, and that's the nature of a criminal case. Testimony goes in, direct examination, cross examination, back and forth. Exhibits go in, back and forth. All right, and then comes the denouement, the conclusion. Right, all right, the climax. That's closing arguments. And I closing arguments is you on the trial situation. That's your telling the jury what you think the evidence has shown, and maybe more importantly, as a defense, when you do the defense side, what the evidence hasn't shown, what one might expect the evidence to show, but it's not there, because in a criminal case, you know what the burden of proof is, beyond a reasonable doubt.
Mhm.
So your job is to point out whether or not there is a reasonable doubt. People ask me throughout my entire career uh, as a lawyer, have you ever defended somebody who in fact did something wrong? I said, of course I have. All right. How do you do that? It has nothing to deal with that. There's a constitution. The constitution says if you're going to be convicted or acquitted, right, but convicted of a crime, certain T's must be crossed, certain I's must be dotted, and it's your job to see to it that if in fact your client is convicted, he was convicted properly, all right, with all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted. That's a criminal case, and it's not really different uh, in the civil field. In the civil field either, essentially the same steps, except you don't have to. You're not dealing with incarceration. You're not dealing with loss of liberty. Uh, you know how important liberty is when you visited somebody and that's incarcerated, that's being held in jail. Uh, that's why this program they have for kids, where they take them to the jails, I think is so successful. Find out what it is not to be able to walk outside. So
You have a cell door closed behind you, not just for a day. You're not in the drunk tank overnight. You're going to be there for years of your life. You're
right,
right. You're right. I remember the show Beyond Scared Straight, which used to air on A&E. I think it still
right,
does. And
mhm,
it would scare the crap out of those kids, and you'd see the aftermath. Those kids would be right back on the straight and narrow. And it eliminated one of the questions I was going to ask you. And I'm glad you answered it. So that's no problem there. Because it reminds me of a line I heard in a movie years ago. I can't quite remember the movie, but I do remember this line, which is, you may not respect the rank, but you may not respect the man, but you have to respect his rank. It's the same thing here. You may not particularly, not you specifically, but generally speaking, care for the client. Maybe he or she's a bad person, but you have to respect the Constitution. And I love the way you put that. Certain T's need to be crossed, certain I's dotted. I never heard it from that perspective, but I'm glad I did here. Absolutely.
You're welcome.
Yeah, appreciate it. So as far as negligence is concerned, again, many different facets to that. When it came to that aspect of litigation, were you representing people who were personally accused of negligence, corporations that were accused, or a mixture of both?
Both. Negligence is in the mass majority of the cases. All right, it's insurance company. Is an insurance company that has a policy,
Right.
a liability policy that protects you. You have a car, I assume. Your car has an insurance policy in it. If you inadvertently make a left-hand turn and hit somebody tomorrow, and they're injured, or there's property damage, your insurance company covers you. That's why insurance is mandatory. Uh, uh, People and both sides, people get sued for negligence, and people sue other people to recover damages. Damages really translates into money for the injuries they sustained as a result of the alleged neglect of somebody. All right, those cases tend to take longer. They have a longer shelf life than most criminal cases, because you have the speedy trial rules in criminal cases that are strict. Negligence cases starts out with what's called a complaint. The complaint is a piece of paper, or lots of papers, that allege A, B, C, D, E, right through Z, all right, as to what the acts of neglect were. All right, and then you have an answer. The answer generally responds to the allegations, and that frames the issue. The issue, what is to be decided. What happens after that is called the discovery process, which includes a lot of things. In New York, the civil practice law and rules have volumes and volumes and volumes that deal with the discovery aspect of a case. And once again, discovery is lawyers do it the right way, and they all do. I know everything about your case. You know everything about my case. All right. You can question the strength of somebody's case. But negligence also includes a discovery device called a deposition. Ever sit for a deposition? A deposition is a pretrial. Something happens pretrial outside the courthouse, where the lawyers for each side get to ask witnesses, including parties to the lawsuit, questions: who, what, where, why, when, how, and how much. All right. Both sides get to do, and by the way, they're transcribed by a court reporter. All right. They are done. They're signed by the person who is deposed. That's the person who's put under oath, and it becomes a large part of the trial, because at trial you can read the depositions to a jury or to a judge. Don't forget, not all cases are jury cases. Sometimes the parties waive a jury, but nowadays, right, there's a great deal of these cases go into ADR, alternate dispute resolution, which is either a mediation or an arbitration. All right, that's not in the courthouse. In many instances, there's a lot of companies that are ADR firms, and what they do is the lawyers come in sometimes or most of the times with their clients, especially the plaintiff, especially the person who's claiming negligence, and they sit with a trained arbitrator. In many instances, it's a retired judge. In many instances, it's an esteemed and lawyer, experienced lawyer, who sits with the parties, and they go back and forth, with an attempt to resolve the case short of a trial. It helps the system reduce the backlog. That's something that's there. When it doesn't happen, when sometimes ADR doesn't work, then of course there's the trial. The trial follows the same, almost the same track as a criminal case, except in a criminal case, the judge is present. The judge presides over jury selection. In a civil case, the judge does not. In New York, the lawyers go down to central jury or up to central jury, depending on where it is. There is a pool of jurors picked, and the lawyers question the jurors outside the presence of a judge. The only time a judge gets involved is when there's an issue as to whether or not a juror should be excused or not. Now, if you check Newsday a few years ago, there was an article printed, I don't know if you caught it, by a judge who got called into jury duty. It was me. And I went because I wanted to serve. I mean, I was willing to serve, and nobody picked me. But I was willing to serve, and I kept thinking, because I got put into a room, with the other with other people, and you pick out six, six from a drum, and I kept saying to myself, every time my name comes up, these guys are throwing it back in the drum. So I wrote an article. Newsday published it, the Long Island paper, about what it was like, and it's something I was looking forward to. If I get served again with a jury summons, I'm going to go again. All right, because I think that jury service could be a really rewarding experience for people to be right there. It's like I heard you over talking baseball with your brother. All right,
Mm-hmm.
it's like being right there in the dugout, so to speak, next to the bench coach. All right, you're right there. You see everything happening. All right, you see there's a lot of drama in cases. There's a lot of humor in cases. I've had the opportunity to lecture in the last year or so at Yale Law School, at NYU Law School, at Hofstra, at Toro, and out in the Aspen Conference, out in Aspen, Colorado. And there's something I said that I said about effective trial technique. I said effective trial technique is a marriage of ballet and burlesque. There comes a time you have to know when to take off the tutu and the ballet shoes and go for the cream pie. And that's effective trial technique. Somebody asked me last week, because like I said, I'm 73. I'm on what's called certification, which is good till I'm 74, and then I theoretically qualify for one more certification till I'm 76, God willing. Is there anything I'd want to do before I really retire? All right, and very sincerely, I said I would love to one more time in my career stand before a jury, not as a judge, but as a lawyer, one more time. It's a wish. We'll see if it ever happens.
Yeah, hopefully it does. Hopefully it does. And especially with all that you've given, I don't see why they wouldn't grant you that opportunity. And it would be a great thing if you could. And again, different perspectives, different facets. And I'm glad you explained it. Now, we do have a question in the live chat from Pete Segretti. For those in the audience that may not be familiar with Pete, he's a retired member of the NYPD Emergency Service Unit, was also in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Vic, if we could highlight his question here. He says he wants to know how you feel about bail reform.
So I can't comment on that.
Okay,
It's something that here's the rules. If it's something that may or may not come before me, I don't go there.
Yeah, no problem. Just wanted to highlight his question. Just
but
in case.
I appreciate the question, but it's something I should stay away from.
Oh, no problem. Totally understood. No problem at all. Pete, we do appreciate the question. Thank you for submitting it anyway. Good man, Pete Segretti, did 28 years in the NYPD. Now we'll move on to the commercial aspect, which I think is particularly interesting because if my interpretation is correct, and it may not be, and this is why you're here, you can correct me. Is this more dealing in the corporate realm when you talk about commercial litigation, or am I misguided?
Commercial litigation has become a major component in New York. I sit as a commercial division judge. That's my actual designation. I sit as a commercial division judge. I also sit as the mesothelioma judge. I handle the asbestos cases in New York. The commercial division deals with some extraordinarily complex commercial matters. They could deal with contracts, secured instruments, commercial foreclosures, business divorces, so to speak, a couple of people or several people form an LLC, limited liability corporation. They're not getting along. The corporation has assets. There's allegations back and forth between the parties, and it's complex litigation. And oftentimes it has a very, very lengthy shelf life. Some of it can go into the tens, hundreds, millions, tens of millions of dollars, and even more. Okay, so and we're dealing not like in a negligence case. Okay, where it's an insurance company who's in the business of evaluating claims and settling claims. So it's money that's coming from, let's say, a third party. In the commercial, it's real money. It's money that people have to understand that there's some exposure. But what I tell people in commercial cases, I bring the lawyers and the parties into the courthouse often. I do that so they know that that we're really interested in moving the case along, because I think that if your name appears in a caption, your name, Mike, A versus Mike Colón, right? That plays on your mind 24/7. That there is a lawsuit pending against you, and the sooner and fairly we get that resolved, we give everybody, plaintiffs and defendants, a peace of mind. So the commercial division is a statewide division. It's got committees. It has rules that are limited to commercial cases. Rules on the length of depositions, things called interrogatories, which I didn't talk about. You very rarely see interrogatories in negligence, but interrogatories are written questions that require written answers. All right. You see depositions, several parties. There's people that are involved that are named, and there's also witnesses. The witnesses could be employees who witnessed whether or not a member of the LLC or an officer of the corporation did A, B, and C. That creates an issue with the other side. They're complex cases, and I spend a great deal of my time on those cases. There's something else in all litigation I didn't mention: criminal, negligence, commercial, and asbestos. It's called motion practice. Have you ever heard of it?
No. Feel free to explain it, though, to the audience.
Okay. Before a case gets from start to finish, all right, lawyers are permitted to make what we call motions, all side. And a motion is a request for the court to do something, right? Somewhere in between the beginning and end. That something could be anything from dismissing the case, limiting the case, making rulings on whether or not certain materials that are requested in discovery are protected by intellectual property rights, trade secrets, and things like that. Motion practice is extensive in civil litigation, and it's helpful because it gives everybody, lawyers and parties, their eyes are wide open as to what the court will allow and what the court will not allow. All right. And I suspect most of the paperwork involved in a case from beginning to end is dedicated to the motion practice, and you see it all over, including things like what they call motions in limine. A motion in limine is before trial. Somebody says, we anticipate these questions, these issues coming up during jury selection or during trial. It's only fair, Judge, that everybody has their eyes open as to where you're going to go, how you're going to rule on these things. And you have to decide them. And they're lengthy and they're comprehensive. All right. The commercial lawyers are, in most cases, they limit their practices to commercial litigation, and they're good. All sides are good. All right. Interesting thing, like unlike criminal law, or not even negligence law, where the lawyers find a niche either in the plaintiff's world or the defendant's world. In the commercial world, they switch hats. They can represent a plaintiff in a commercial case today and a defendant in a commercial case tomorrow, because
wow.
the law is quite specific, and the commercial bar is a very competent bar, as is our criminal bar, as is our negligence bar. We have in Suffolk County a really good combination of lawyers and judges. My colleagues, I'm proud of all my colleagues out here.
It's good to have a concrete understanding of these things. And again, appreciate the explanation. We're talking with Judge Jerry Garguilo here in episode 287 of the Mike the New Haven podcast. This has been quite the education tonight, and we certainly do appreciate it. Just before we continue, I want to shout out a few more people tuning in. Joe Reek, retired inspector in the NYPD, currently with the Port Authority Police. Margaret Hearn, Peter Pranzo, author and retired NYPD lieutenant. He was in the street crime unit. I mentioned John Costello earlier. He's here. Mark W.'s here, and Joe Seriato is here tuning in via YouTube as well. So appreciate you guys watching. So we get to that moment in 2009 where it's 30 years now in private practice. And you did mention before that you always wanted to be a judge someday. And here that day comes. And I imagine in a moment, in a career full, I should say, of a lot of great moments and a lot of proud moments that made you happy and glad to be doing what you're doing, this had to be the proudest. So when that day came, tell me about your emotions.
On the day that I took my oath of office, my mom and dad were alive and with us. My father was an only child, and he was a hardcore guy with a heart as big as the moon. I mean, he lived for his family, his wife, his kids, and his grandchildren. What I'll never forget is when I took the oath of office and had to give my little speech. I looked at the front row and I saw tears pouring down my father's eyes. All right. And my father and I are like only 20 years apart. They got married as teenagers, I think 19 and 20. And I was born. My father says, you were born 10 months and 1 day from the day we said I do. So everybody in Brooklyn was looking at us funny. Right. And making him happy was the best part. Making him happy and proud was the best part of it. And of course, my brothers and my sister were there. That was an exhilarating moment. The second moment was the first time they banged me into a courtroom. All right. In other words, the door opens up. The court staff says, "All rise!" Bang. The court officer. Door opens up, and you walk out, and there's people standing there. And it's the first time in your career, because you've been on the other side all these years, that you're walking up those steps onto the bench, and time stands still for about 30 seconds. You take a deep breath and you look out and say, "Holy smokes, I'm here. I made it." And I think my first 2 years, I actually sat in the matrimonial part. That's where we call different sections of the courts parts. When I first became an assistant DA, I didn't understand why you call it a part, but they call it a part. So I sat in the matrimonial part. So it was always a big crowd there every day. That was a heck of a moment. And then when you start doing your conferences and you start to, get your stride, it becomes more and more routine as the years go by. And I'm just about finishing my 15th year now. So I look forward to it every day.
Of course, I was going to say, the more you do it, the more natural it becomes, because it goes back to conversations I have when I'm interviewing my cops and firemen on this show, which is when you first get promoted from officer to sergeant, or in a fireman's case, from firefighter to lieutenant, the other side of it. Now you're on the other side where, listen, in this case, you're on the bench, and in their case, they're giving orders. So
I tell people, the first time you're called upon to put together a kid's tricycle, with the screws and the wheels, it takes you 3.5 hours. The second time you do it in 2 hours. The third time you do it in a half hour. It's the same. It's the same logic. It's anything you do in life. What you do, what I do, what your brother does, what anybody does. Because the routine becomes more common, so to speak.
Oh, it's an interesting evolution. Like you say, you're about to complete your 15th year on the bench. Now, you've been able to serve as member and chairman of a few different committees. We'll start with unlawful practice. Dive into that if you don't mind.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. I think Lou England was the president of the Bar Association back then. He asked me to chair the Unlawful Practice Committee, and what that is, it deals at the time there were the issue at the time was that they were paralegals setting up offices uh, and were rendering services, and the question was whether or not the services they rendered were in fact the practice of law or not. That was the big issue back then. Uh, then, of course, uh, if you have lawyers that for some reason was suspended from practice for a period of time, you had to look out to see whether they were actually practicing. But that was that was a pretty interesting committee. We didn't have a heck of a lot, but when we had cases, uh, we talked about them. We asked questions. For instance, what happened was way back when uh, there were firms from all over the country, not all over the country, but there were firms that were brief writing people. So let's say I had a real tough issue. Uh, uh, as a lawyer, I could hire these, and they were lawyers to write a brief. And the question is whether or not that qualified as practicing law within the state. Because at the time, in order to practice law in the state of New York, you had to have an office in the state of New York. Or uh, I think that rule was recently changed, by the way, because now you get lawyers from all over the country appearing, especially in the commercial division, because there's a thing called pro hac vice admission. Pro hac vice. And what it means, a lawyer from another jurisdiction that isn't sworn in New York is permitted to come to New York and handle a case based upon a petition to the court that they're an attorney in good standing in the place where they hang their shingle, and you review the petition, you confirm that they have a good reputation, they were a lawyer in good standing, and you'll allow them uh, into the case. That's become more and more common. I had a case recently where I looked at the papers. I told the lawyer, your main office is in Atlanta, Georgia. He said, yeah. I said, welcome to New York. Uh, I was pro hac vice as a lawyer in Philadelphia, federal court, and and one time in Omaha, Nebraska, on a criminal case. It was fun. Uh, it was a few days away from home.
I'll say, your own version of my cousin Vinny. Why not?
And Omaha, Nebraska, you betcha.
Yeah. As a New Yorker.
Mhm.
As a New Yorker. Then there was the Judicial Screening Committee. Now, what went into that, I should say.
That's a very important committee. I was a member of the Judicial Screening Committee, I think, for 10 years. And that's where lawyers who were seeking nominations to become a judge uh, come before the committee with their resumes and explain to the committee what their accomplishments are, the why they want to take the bench. All right, and the committee then makes a determination as to nowadays either qualified or not. Uh, the old days used to be very well qualified, qualified, or not qualified. Now it's essentially either qualified or not. And that committee, I haven't been on that committee in a long time, but that committee works very hard, very long hours, uh, and oftentimes late into the night because they have to get all these screenings done long before long before the petitions come out, because the rating by the Bar Association, by the screening committee, is very important.
And the other two committees that we can bunch together in this question is District Court and Supreme Court. We'll start with District.
The district court is essentially a committee that meets with the presiding judge of the district court. Now, let's talk about that.
Mhm.
In Suffolk, we have the district court, which is the misdemeanor court, small claims, some civil jurisdiction up to a certain amount of money. Then you have the county court, which is essentially the felony court, which is out in Riverhead. That's where most of the felonies are tried. They also have some civil jurisdiction, again, depending on the amount of money in dispute. Then you have the Supreme Court. Those are the three tiers, essentially the three tiers of trial courts. You also have village courts and justice courts. all over Long Island that handle things like traffic tickets and minor disputes between people. The district court committee, the the job of the district court committee was to communicate with lawyers that practice in the district court, judges that preside in the district court, and the presiding judge of the district court, because each of those courts I mentioned has a presiding judge. A presiding judge is a judge who's essentially is the supervising judge of all the judges in that court. Talk about and discuss ways to make the process smooth. What improvements could we make? What's the criticisms of things that are going on? Can we address the criticisms? Can we make it better? That was I sat on that committee. I forget for how long. I think a few years it could be. And then there's a Supreme Court committee, which essentially does the same thing as the district court committee, except with the presiding judge of the Supreme Court. The lawyers that practice there discuss rules, discuss proposed amendments, sometimes discuss pending legislation that impacts the practice in those courts. A good committee, a hot committee in terms of everybody participating. And I also sit as a member of the commercial division, which we have our own committee here in Suffolk County, and we also collaborate with Nassau County, because Nassau County has a designated commercial division judges also. And we have meetings. We have committee meetings, but we also have a get together, oftentimes at Nassau and Suffolk, to meet and greet each other and discuss what's going on. Committees are very important, and the lawyers and the judges that work in these committees are dedicated people, good dedicated people.
I've always wanted to ask this, and I have the right person to ask tonight, which is how these cases specifically get assigned to a judge, because there's a myriad of different factors, myriad of different judges. So in your instance, how do the cases find their way to you specifically?
Well, if it's a commercial case, it's going to go to a commercial division judge, and there's three of us in Suffolk County, and basically it's who's up on whose turn it is. The clerk says Judge Garguilo got the last one, so Judge so and so will get the next one, Judge so and so will get the next one, and we're back. In the criminal cases, the cases get assigned to a judge on day one. So in other words, a judge sitting in district court gets however cases been assigned. Those cases are their cases. They handle those cases from start to finish. There's no picking and choosing. Negligence is kind of interesting because there is a judge assigned the case on day one. Day one is a time where essentially normally the complaint, which I told you about, is filed. The answer is filed. And along comes what's called an RJI, Request for Judicial Intervention, RJI. The clerk gets the RJI and assigns the case to, again, whatever judge is up next. That case stays with that judge. But there comes a time, oftentimes, that the case is ripe for trial. And the judge that has the case at the RJI may or may not be the trial judge, depending on availability, length of the trial, what's going on in the judge's life. And it gets assigned to a judge that has the staff and the resources to handle it at the time. I mean, there's no magic to it. I mean, I'm talking about Suffolk County, which is what I know best. All right.
Right.
I mean, I've been to other counties in my career. I think I tried cases in Brooklyn. I tried cases in Nassau and Suffolk. I may have tried a case in Queens. I tried a criminal case in Manhattan. You get around. What I don't understand now is that I wake up in the morning now and I ask myself, how did you do it? How did you wake up in the morning and say, you have a case in district court today, you have a case in county court today, and you have a Supreme Court case a little later on in the day? How did you drive all those miles and still survive?
Especially in New York traffic.
Yeah, and cover them.
Yeah.
I did it every day. Mm-hmm. Do I miss it? Sometimes I do. All right. Sometimes the convenience of driving 10.5 miles from my house to the courthouse, going north and south on Long Island as opposed to east and west, is a pleasure.
There you go. There you go. And like, emphasis being on sometimes.
Right.
I did want to ask you about this as well, as for those of my audience that don't have a familiarity with the area. Most of my audience is New Yorkers, but there are some that aren't. The 9th and 10th judicial districts, what territory are we talking? What part of Long Island
Nassau,
do those
Nassau,
districts cover?
Suffolk, Nassau,
Nassau,
Suffolk
Suffolk.
County.
All right, so easy enough.
I sit in there.
I did not.
Okay. The appellate term is an intermediate appellate court that basically hears appeals out of the district courts and the local courts, the village courts, the justice courts. Those are courts, the outlying courts. We sit in, I think we cover 5 or 6 counties, the 9th and 10th Judicial District. Nassau, Suffolk, Westchester, Putnam County, even north of there, up as north as Poughkeepsie. We sit generally once or twice a month, and we hear appeals. I'll tell you about that process. That process, and I'm the presiding judge of the appellate term in our district. There's three things you can ask an appellate court to do. 3, all right? Any appellate court. You can tell them to affirm the decision that's being appealed. You can tell them to reverse the decision that's being appealed, or you can ask them to modify the decision that's being appealed. That means, in some instances, modification means the judge. It's my impression that the court was right on A, B, and C, but I think you should take a look at D, E, and F. That is done by briefs are submitted. The person who is taking the appeal, the person who wants the appellate court to take a look at what happened in the court below, files a brief. And the brief sets forth what the law is, what they believe the facts are, and how they meld the law and the facts together. All right, and they seek a remedy. The other side is called a respondent. The respondent replies to that brief, right, in a brief. Eventually, the case gets put on for oral argument if the lawyers want it, because sometimes they just say, we don't need oral argument. You can decide the case on the papers. And the oral argument is really it's good, because it's a give and take between the judges. When we have oral argument, 3 judges sit on the panel. So 3 of us sit on the panel. We review the briefs, we hear the oral arguments, and then we conference the case privately and decide which way the court is going to go. I had a thought about that, but it just slipped my mind. It'll come back to me. That's the appeals process. And again, you have the appellate term, I told you, district courts, misdemeanor courts, all the traffic courts. You have the appellate division, which is essentially the Supreme Court, and in many instances, the county court. And you have the Court of Appeals, which is the court of last resort, so to speak. That's the system, top to bottom, or bottom to top. All right. The lower courts are very important. They lower important because that's the citizens, oftentimes first interaction with the judicial system. All right, and part and parcel of a judge's job is make people comfortable. Don't feel estranged because you're there. It's your courts. The courts are there to serve you. And like I said, we have a very, very proud bench. We have great administrators. Judge Krecker is the administrative judge of all the Suffolk County courts. Judge St. George Norman St. George oversees a great deal of work in statewide. Very helpful people. And they do a great job.
You can compare the court essentially to a human body. The leg does not function without the arm, does not function without the foot, and so on and so forth. It's several different components. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because some might scoff at the notion of lower courts, traffic courts, things like that, but there's a function. It's essentially a chain of command, like you'd liken it to the military as well, that has to be followed. What you mentioned earlier, every T needs to be crossed, every I dotted. That's why those courts are there. That's why those courts are there.
Right.
So, and this is something. Oh, you want to add something? I apologize.
I did, but I forgot it. I got to tell you something. I get up at 4. I get up at about 4:30 every morning.
Mhm.
I'm at the gym by 5:10.
Good for you.
I'm at work by 9. I had a long day today, so something will slip my mind, but it'll come to me probably 10 minutes after we're done.
That's more than okay. You're doing a great job. You're certainly educating me and educating the audience tonight, and we appreciate it. One thing I did want to spend just a little bit of time on, because this was something that was in your court, quite literally, and that was the opioids trial. And this is something that's tugging at the heartstrings of many. It's ripped at the country. It's ripped at many different families. So many people have been adversely impacted by it. And now it comes in the New York sense to your courtroom. Now, for those that may not have a familiarity with the particular aspects of this case, as far as what we can discuss, what was this case comprised of? And out of all the cases you've handled in your near 50 years of experience, how difficult was this case to handle, if at all?
First of all, the opioid case was called a coordinated case, and we have a concept called venue. Venue is if you are a resident of Suffolk County and you have a case, you bring the case, you have an opportunity to bring the case in your venue, Suffolk County, right? In the opioid litigation, I think there's 61 or 62 counties. So every county potentially could have been a venue for for the case, a specific venue. Suffolk does Suffolk, Nassau does Suffolk, the city does the city, Rensselaer County, Wyoming County, places you never even heard of, all right?
Right.
So it was called a coordinated case. And it was coordinated because there was a determination to have the cases heard, all the cases, despite the change, the venue aspects of it, all the cases to be brought in one court, and that was Suffolk County, the Suffolk County courts. What's the logic of that? Well, the case is a Supreme Court case, so if you have 61 Supreme Court judges hearing the case, hearing essentially uh, allegations and having to decide motions, there's a potential you're going to have conflicting decisions among the various counties. So they coordinate the cases, and all the cases get heard on a coordinated basis before one court, and that court was Suffolk County. So the case started with one case, Suffolk County, and then it grew. It grew as other counties filed lawsuits. The cases got transferred to Suffolk County for coordination. Coordination means the same process I told you about in a civil case: summons, complaint, motion practice, discovery, uh, jury selection, and trial. Uh, what the court could not have handled the case without the aid and assistance of Judge Marks, who at the time was on the top of the second to top of the court system. Judge St. George eventually took his place. Judge Cracker. They provided us with the resources we need in order to manage the case. There were times the case was live streamed, as you may or may not know. The trial was live streamed on a nationwide basis.
Oh, yes.
So there were times where there were more than 100 lawyers participating. So much so that they couldn't fit them in any courtroom. So they took we had the pleasure of having a law school, Toro Law School, take their big auditorium and convert it into I don't know if you know this, they converted it into a courtroom because they had big seats all over the place, they had a balcony, and all the lawyers could come in. Oftentimes it was like, the children's puzzle, Where's Waldo?
Yes.
You walk in and see, lots and lots of lawyers. Uh, I can speak of what's a matter of record. There were over 9,000 documents filed in connection with the case. It's called ECF, electronic filing, right? Uh, I think before this case, the record number of filings was about 1,700. So there was 9,000 filings. Uh, there were 900 trial exhibits. Trial exhibit is a document that's produced during the course of the trial for the jury to consider. Um, the court had to the court rendered about 400 written decisions, either what they call short form orders, court notices, or uh, formal decisions along the way, mostly in terms of motion practice and discovery. We screened 500 jurors uh, because, part of the important thing is, by the way, the lawyers were spectacular, both sides, all sides. Great lawyers, prepared every day. How they did it, I don't know. They lived out of hotels because they came up here. They stayed basically at the two hotels by the courthouse or one up in Huntington. And they showed up every day prepared. They knew their cases. It was a pleasure working with them. Uh, the I told you before that in civil trials that the judge doesn't participate. Remember, I said you go to a room.
Yes.
In this case, it was different. We thought that the court should participate, and the court did participate in the jury selection. We pre-screened 500 jurors with a questionnaire, a jury questionnaire, a comprehensive questionnaire. And at the end of the screening process, which took, I guess, I forget now, probably took about a week. At the end of the screening process, we came up with 6 jurors, primary jurors. And in all civil cases, and criminal cases, you have alternate jurors. So you have a primary, in a civil case, you have 6 primary jurors, and you can have up to 6 alternate jurors. And an alternate juror is a juror who sits, takes the same oath as all the other jurors, but is called upon to participate in deliberations in the event one of the primary jurors gets sick or can't make it. So we had 6 and 6, so we had 12. Uh, in criminal cases, of course, in felonies you have 12 jurors. In misdemeanors you have 6. Uh, we had 12 jurors starting, and that jury sat for about 6 months, right? And they paid attention. They were a great group of people. I could tell you, I treated them to Garguilo bakery products in the morning. I brought stuff in because they were so dedicated. Uh, and they rendered their verdict, I think, like on December 29th. It'll be, that was the date. And they deliberated for about 10 days, constant deliberations, 10 days. And it was important because they paid attention. They called for all the exhibits, 900 exhibits. These aren't one-page exhibits.
It's long.
uh, they called for deposition testimony because there was a lot of deposition testimony. Again, the case was live streamed, and it was certainly the most challenging case I've ever seen in my career. But I'm certain that many of my colleagues could have handled it just as well as I did. They were helpful. And like I said, Judge Marks, Judge St. George, Judge Greco gave the court, I don't say me, the court, gave the court resources to do it. Don't forget, because we were at another location, most cases you have one stenographer, right? One person.
Yes.
We had to have multiple stenographers because there's so much work. And they worked in shifts. And why? Because the lawyers ordered the court minutes on a daily basis. So that we get done at 5 o'clock, by 8 o'clock at night, those lawyers have the minutes from that day, the testimony, and they work through the night. So we had multiple stenographers. We had multiple court offices because they had to set up all of the security at Toro at the law school, clerks. They gave me a great deal of research assistance, which I needed, which I didn't need. The court needed, and we got to the finish line eventually. There was a verdict, but eventually all the cases were resolved by settlement. And the settlement documents, I think they're all uploaded. Were they ran 95 pages long each one. We got done. Uh, uh, I'll talk about it. I guess I'll remember bits and pieces of it throughout my the balance of my life. But the lawyers were a pleasure. Both sides, good people from all over the country. By the way, not just New York, all over the country. They came from as far as California. Uh, we had firms from Boston. I'm sure we had people out of the Washington D.C. area. We had Texas lawyers uh, who fit right in. Right? So the the beneficiaries were the concession people in the courthouse.
Oh, I'm sure.
They didn't have that many. They had more customers than they ever dreamt they would have. Right?
Yeah.
So it was good. It was good, and it was an experience.
I think that's the best way to sum it up. Before I get to the rapid fire, I do want to ask you this, and this is a career that's not over yet. It's still going. But if you could look back on everything you've done to this point and just define your career in a sentence, what would that sentence be, Judge?
Strive to get it right.
I like it. Simple, to the point. It's true. It's true. That should be the aim in every profession, like you talked about earlier. Every job, that should be the aim. I love that. Very well put. Now that brings us to the hardest part of the show. It's the rapid fire, because what that is 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you. You can say pass if you want. Are you ready?
Okay, rapid fire.
Yep, 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 hit and run answers from you to those questions, but you could say pass if you want, if you don't have an answer at the top.
Okay.
So it's fine. So we'll go right into it. The first one, and you've talked about it. You talked about the advice your father gave you many years ago. But besides him and his wise advice, what's the best advice anyone ever gave you besides your father?
Be honest.
Good. Love it. Second, most uplifting outcome you've ever had to a case, either as a prosecutor or in private practice or as a judge. Most uplifting outcome.
Just before the end of my career, I tried a case on behalf of a couple of doctors. It was a hostile work environment case. And during the course of the trial, I had to examine the psychiatrist for the other side. At the end of the trial, my dear friend Judge Baisley, I was a lawyer, said the jury would like to see you in chambers after it was over. I walked in chambers, and the jury gave me an ovation.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I've never heard that before. That must have been quite the feeling.
It was. I mean, and they were a good group.
Yeah, love that. Thanks for sharing that. Third, I know, because I remember seeing this on your daughter's Instagram story a while ago. This is how I know this. You're a massive Frank Sinatra fan. So you got to tell me, what's your favorite Frank Sinatra song?
The Summer Wind.
There you go. Summer Wind it is. And fourth, if you could have one meal for the rest of your life, what would that meal be?
So many good ones. Eggplant palm.
Yeah, not a bad choice. That's a classic, oldie but goodie. And fifth and finally, knowing what you know now, if you can go back in time and give advice to a younger version of yourself, what would the Jerry Garguilo of now tell the Jerry Garguilo of then?
It's okay to say no once in a while.
I like it.
I tell my kids that. So you enjoyed my daughter Joelle, I hear. So that's good to know.
Yes, I did. She was a good guest. She's a very good guest. As were you. You were fantastic. This has been an absolute pleasure. Stick around. We'll talk off the air, so don't go anywhere just yet. Sure. But before I say goodbye to the audience, any shout outs to anyone or anything that you'd like to give?
Angela, my wife, thank you for having patience with me. Ava Marie, my 18-month-old, I can't wait to see you again. Gianna, Viviana, and AJ, Papa's going to see you real soon. My daughter Nicole, my daughter Jackie. I love you guys. You've put up with me for all of these years, especially Angela, 50 years married.
Wow.
You know? So one of the priests asked if we wanted it. She said, "Jerry, do you want to redo your marriage vows?" I said, "No, Father, no." She might say no.
There you go. Shout out to all of them. And as we said at the top, shout out to Joelle, who's been great to me over the years. She's a big reason why you and I are talking right now. And she's a big reason why the show is where it is, because she gave me simple advice 3 years ago that I needed to hear. And that was, make this the kind of podcast you would want to listen to. So without that advice, I don't know where I'd be. So Joelle, if you're watching, if you're listening, thank you. Much love to you. And hopefully we'll see each other soon. Judge, this has been great. Like I said, stick around. We'll say our goodbyes off the air. To the audience, thanks. Thanks for tuning in tonight. Coming up next on the Mike the New Haven podcast, we got 2 shows left. They're both going to be FDNY shows. He was a captain for many years, did most of his 25 years in the New York City Fire Department in ladder companies, particularly in the area of Brooklyn. That's going to be Captain Jim Graham for another volume of the best, the bravest interviews with the FDNY's elite. He's a Rockville Center guy. And for the last show of the year, I'm excited about this one. He's currently, I believe, the number, if you're talking uniform personnel, number 2 in the FDNY. Currently the FDNY Chief of Operations, John Esposito, will be the last show of 2023. That's going to be Tuesday, December 12th. So look forward to chronicling his career, which is still going on. Like I said, currently the New York City Fire Department Chief of Operations.
Michael, are we still on?
Yes.
Advice to a young lawyer. I'm holding up a book.
The Emperor's Handbook.
Emperor's Handbook. It's the musings of Marcus Aurelius.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of wisdom in this book. When I lecture kids at Head Start programs, which I have from time to time at Suffolk, I bring this book and say, don't read the whole thing. Just randomly go to a page, pick out a phrase or two, and think about it. So
there you go. Sage advice. Thank you very much. Thanks to everybody that tuned in. And on behalf of producer Vic and Judge Jerry Garguilo, I'm Mike Colón. And we will see you next time. Take care. Have a great weekend. Be safe. We'll see you Tuesday.